If I had to choose one word to describe all of Nintendo's consoles, I would say experimental. In the 80s, Nintendo dominated the early days of home video game consoles with the Nintendo Entertainment System and its successor, the Super Nintendo. But while the Super NES was clearly following in the footsteps of the NES, they immediately broke away from that mold with the Nintendo 64, their first home console capable of rendering 3D graphics, featuring an expandable RAM slot and 4 separate ports for its radically unique controller. Since then, no two Nintendo home consoles have ever truly been alike, each fitted with unique gimmicks and hardware that allow for gameplay experiences unavailable on any other platform. This design philosophy even extends to the handhelds to some degree, although many elements carried over during the gradual evolution from the Game Boy to the 3DS. And there's one franchise that has used practically every single one of these weird and wacky features: Pokemon. In the process of researching for my other videos, I've run into a lot of cases where the series has taken advantage of the available hardware in interesting ways to enhance the gameplay experience, and I thought I might as well talk about some of the more interesting ones, and how one feature has been seemingly overlooked. The Game Boy was a very bare-bones console. It would play video games, and that was basically it. The only thing that really separated it from the Game & Watch devices was the fact that it could play more than one game through the use of cartridges. The only other standout feature of the Game Boy was the link cable that allowed two systems to communicate and enabled multiplayer game modes. Obviously, this feature was vital to the core concept of Pokemon, as battling and trading with other people wouldn't have been possible without it. But when the Game Boy Color released, it included not just an improved display, it also had an infrared sensor on the back. While this wasn't capable of proper wireless communication yet, this sensor could transfer small amounts of data between games using infrared light, similar to how a TV remote sends commands to a TV. In fact, there was a Bomberman game that actually required you to point a TV remote at the infrared sensor to unlock hidden areas. In the case of Pokemon, they used this sensor not just for trading data between games, but for communicating with an external device called the Pokemon Pikachu 2. With the N64, they released Pokemon Stadium and took advantage of the controller's expansion port, a slot on the underside that could be used to connect accessory packs, such as a memory card or the Rumble feature. Pokemon Stadium came bundled with the transfer pack, which could read the game data from cartridges inserted into it. The N64 also had a game called Hey You Pikachu, which utilised an accessory called the Voice Recognition Unit, a rudimentary microphone that can interpret preset voice commands and allow you to interact with Pikachu by speaking. The VRU was only ever used for one other game, a Japanese train simulator called Densha de Go 64. And since the VRUs were region locked, presumably because they couldn't fit more than one language onto them, the English version of the VRU is effectively exclusive to Hey You Pikachu. The Game Boy Advance was then the next step up from the Game Boy Color, and included an even more colourful display, as well as a multi-boot mode that could be accessed by holding down Select and Start during the boot screen. This allowed for games and programs to be downloaded via the link cable, and could be used to play multiplayer in various games without needing a second cartridge, such as Mario Kart Super Circuit and Nightmare in Dreamland. This feature wasn't really utilised for any Pokemon games, since you can't really do multiplayer without your own cartridge to trade or battle with, although this technology was used as a way to receive Pokemon from event distributions. The GBA did have a few accessories though, the main one being the e-reader. This tool would scan dot codes and then inject that code into the GBA, either to run small minigame programs or to modify the data of a game that you're playing. You might actually own a few e-reader cards even if you never owned an e-reader, as certain Pokemon cards released around that time had e-reader dot codes printed onto them, and scanning them would allow you to see a Pokédex entry on the Game Boy. The e-reader also had special cards for modifying Pokemon games, that could be used to access special berries or modify the trainers that you face in the Trainer Tower or the house in Moss Deep City. There's a surprising amount of stuff that you can do with the e-reader as a code injection tool, and I talked about it more in a previous video if you want to learn more. A wireless adapter was also available for the GBA, and was released with copies of Fire Red and Leaf Green, which would connect to the link cable port on the Game Boy Advance and allowed for short-range communication with other systems. Unlike the IR sensor, this adapter could replicate all functions of the link cable. However, it only worked for games that had been programmed with compatibility for the wireless adapter, and the number of games it could be used with was relatively small since the adapter released almost 3 years into the GBA's lifespan. But while most Game Boy games only considered the possibility of 4 players connecting at a time through link cables, Pokemon could host almost 40 people simultaneously in the Union Room using the wireless adapter, allowing players in Fire Red, Leaf Green and Emerald to seamlessly trade, battle and exchange trainer card information without having to link with each other separately. The GBA also had a GameCube adapter cable that allowed you to communicate between compatible GBA and GameCube games, such as Metroid Fusion and Metroid Prime, or Sonic Advance and Sonic Adventure 2. This cable allowed you to trade with Pokemon Colosseum, store your collection in Pokemon Box, or download event Pokemon like Celebi and Jirachi through promotional distribution discs. And as the Game Boy brand came to an end, the Nintendo DS took its place in 2004. This system was a major technical upgrade and came with a host of built-in features: a microphone, 2 cartridge slots, a touchscreen, wireless communication, Wi-Fi compatibility, and of course the titular dual screens. The system also had its own home screen, an internal clock and calendar, and 2 programs that could be run without cartridges, PictoChat and Download Play, which could be seen as a successor to the multi-boot mode from the GBA. In 2008, the DSi would then serve as a functional upgrade to the DS by adding 2 cameras, more applications, and an eShop that allowed you to purchase and download digital games. The only drawback with the DSi was the lack of the secondary cartridge slot, removing Game Boy Advance compatibility and making any game features that use the dual slot inaccessible. And now with access to so many features without needing to rely on hardware add-ons, generations 4 and 5 would make great use of them all. The microphone could be used for recording custom chat cries and interacting with the underground in Sinnoh, and even for making voice calls with your friends in black and white using the cross transceiver, which even supported video calls from players with DSi and 3DS systems. The cartridge slot could also be used to play GBA games, as well as transfer Pokemon up from Generation 3, but it could also be used for modifying wild encounters in Sinnoh, and communicating between the red and blue versions of Pokemon Mystery Dungeon. The internal clock also meant that cartridges no longer needed to rely on battery power for keeping track of time, and the touchscreen spawned an entire spin-off series in the form of Pokemon Ranger, as well as being used for several minigames such as the Pokeathlon and Poffin mixing. Wi-Fi connectivity was arguably the biggest game changer in terms of Pokemon though, as it enabled the global trade station, something that Pokemon had actually already experimented with on the Game Boy Color, using a mobile phone adapter cable that would connect to dial-up internet and allowed players to download leaderboards or trade Pokemon over the mobile phone network in Pokemon Crystal. And with the Generation 2 remakes on the DS also came the remake of the Pokemon Pikachu 2 in the form of the Pokewalker. The only problem is that the DS and DSi did not have any IR sensors, so they took the liberty of building a sensor directly into the cartridge itself. This is why Heart Gold and Soul Silver cartridges look black instead of grey. It's actually a very, very dark red that filters out most wavelengths of light so it can more accurately detect infrared signals. And if you hold one of these cartridges up to a bright light, you'll see that red wavelength of light passing through it. Generation 5 also kept this cartridge design and made use of infrared to improve the DS's built-in wireless communication features. The Wii was also able to connect to the DS with wireless communication, and allowed for data sharing with Pokemon Battle Revolution and My Pokemon Ranch, but the Wii's most notable feature was its motion control mechanics, which Pokepark Wii and its sequel would make use of in various minigames. And much like the Wii, the 3DS was also characterised by one prominent feature, the stereoscopic 3D display that worked without the need for special glasses. But this system also had many more features in store. Along with the inclusion of all the other features from the DSi, the 3DS added a step counter, a gyroscope, Street Pass communication, and even brought back the IR sensor from the Game Boy Color. And while the 6th generation of Pokemon games would make their debut on the 3DS, there was one additional feature for Generation 5 that was exclusive to this console, which was the Dream Radar application, an augmented reality game that made use of the gyroscope and cameras to catch Pokemon, which could then be transferred into black and white too. Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire would make use of the Street Pass feature to update secret base data and distribute the Eon Ticket event, which would have been done manually by linking and mixing records in the original Generation 3 titles. You can also make use of the camera during contests to project your live feed onto the background, and for scanning QR codes to obtain mystery gifts. Now, I've just been listing examples here, but there is a point I'm getting to. Pokemon games have always been eager to use all of the tools at their disposal, but it feels like that level of interaction has been lacking for the last few generations since moving to the Nintendo Switch. While not as rich as the 3DS, the Switch itself is far from lacking in features. Aside from being both a handheld and a home console, the Switch also features motion control support, a touchscreen, an IR sensor, Bluetooth, gyroscope, and a HD rumble that can simulate a variety of tactile effects. Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee uses motion controls for throwing Pokeballs, and Bluetooth connection can be used for connecting to Pokemon Go and the Pokeball Plus controller. There is one key feature that you may have noticed I overlooked, one that has been used by many first-party Nintendo games for the last decade, but with virtually no presence within Pokemon. Which leads me to the thought that resulted in this video. Why doesn't Pokemon have Amiibos? To clarify, there are Pokemon-themed Amiibos. Every fighter in Smash Bros. Has an Amiibo figure, so we have them for Mewtwo, Charizard, Jigglypuff, and all the other Pokemon that are represented as fighters, as well as an Amiibo for the original Detective Pikachu game on the 3DS. But one of the main features of Amiibos is that they are multi-purpose. These figures all have a specific function in their own games, but they can also be scanned into other games that have Amiibo compatibility. For example, scanning Zelda-related Amiibos in Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom can spawn unique items and armor, but you can also scan any other Amiibo to get smaller rewards like ingredients and materials. And the Smash Bros. Amiibos can be used as NPC fighters that keep track of their own experience and progress, but Amiibos of the same character from other Amiibo sets can also be used to the same effect, such as the Amiibos from Mario Odyssey also being usable as fighters for Mario, Peach, and Bowser. However, not only do these Pokemon Amiibos have no unique features for Pokemon games, there are no main series games that have any Amiibo functionality at all. The only spin-offs that can interact with Amiibos are Pokken Tournament, which had a limited run of Shadow Mewtwo cards released for the Wii U edition, and Detective Pikachu on the 3DS, which is only compatible with the Detective Pikachu Amiibo and won't allow you to scan any others. At first glance, it seems like Pokemon has just completely ignored the potential of Amiibos, but what if I told you, like always, Pokemon was simply ahead of the trend? The year is 2012, and a new game has just exploded onto both the video game and toy markets: Skylanders. Released in late 2011, this action-adventure game had a roster of over 30 unique playable characters, but in order to play as them, you had to own a physical figure, most of which were sold separately. This toys-to-life concept, as it was known, was insanely profitable, and 30 million Skylander figures were sold in only 6 months. Activision was on track to make $500 million by the end of the year, and they already had a sequel and a second series of figures ready to launch in time for Christmas. This idea of combining video games with physical toys was a massive innovation in the field of exploiting children, and Disney wanted a piece of the pie, releasing their own Toys to Life game in August 2013, just ahead of the third entry in the Skylander franchise. 2 years later, LEGO would also step in and release LEGO Dimensions, but eventually with too many Toys to Life franchises competing for parents' money, they ended up cannibalizing each other, and all three would be discontinued by 2017 as the market dried up. But while Disney Infinity was the first direct contender to Skylanders, Pokemon actually beat them to the punch with a different approach. 4 months before Disney Infinity, Pokemon Rumble U released in Japan, the third entry in the Pokemon Rumble spin-off series developed by Umbrella, the same developers who made Hey You Pikachu back in 1998. And where Skylanders and Disney Infinity made figures mandatory to play the game, Pokemon Rumble decided to experiment with NFC technology as a way to enhance gameplay with optional content. Unlike other Toys to Life figures, Rumble U's NFC figurines were smaller and less expensive, only costing 200 yen in Japan, and £4 or $4 respectively when released in the UK and United States. And fitting with the Pokemon theme, these figures were also packaged inside of capsules, so you wouldn't know which one you were getting until you opened it. 18 different figures were released in 3 waves of 6, with each wave also containing one shiny variant that could be found if you were lucky, either Pikachu in Wave 1, Eevee in Wave 2, and Genesect in Wave 3. Rumble U was actually the first game to make use of the Wii U's built-in NFC reader, meaning they didn't need to sell an additional device for scanning figurines. Anyone with a copy of Rumble U could buy one of these figures and immediately use it in-game. When scanned, these figures would unlock a copy of that Pokemon that you could add to your collection. As far as I can tell, none of these characters were exclusive to the figurines and could be unlocked through normal gameplay, but the figurines allowed you immediate access and were slightly stronger than their normal in-game counterparts. These figurines also predated the release of Amiibos by over a year, and given how their functionality is practically identical, it's possible that they were used as a proof of concept, and to test the waters for Nintendo entering the Toys to Life market on a larger scale. And seeing how successful Amiibos went on to be, it does beg the question why Pokemon has had practically zero application for them since. Amiibo functionality could have existed as far back as Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire with the use of the 3DS NFC reader, or the later new 3DS models that have this function built in. Amiibo could have been scanned as a way to receive special items or event data, or even used like Amiibo fighters and store a trainer team on them that you can battle, much like the e-reader cards that would unlock new berries, the Eon ticket, or special Battle Tower trainers. Amiibos don't even need to utilise full-size figures. Animal Crossing had a series of trading cards with full Amiibo compatibility by having an NFC chip inside each card, and this is also how the Shadow Mewtwo card worked for Pokémon Tournament. But on the other hand, I suppose it's more of a question of whether people would want Amiibos in Pokémon. While the intent is to offer you additional content as a bonus to owning a piece of merchandise, some people only care about the additional content and see it as them being forced to purchase the figure in order to access it. Amiibo also has the drawback of scarcity by being a physical product, and when they first released, there were many figures that were nearly impossible to find due to the demand massively outweighing the supply. There's also recently been vocal outcry towards how Pokemon games operate. Several of the strongest competitive Pokemon at the moment cannot be caught within Scarlet and Violet and have to be transferred in from other games, such as Urshifu, Ursaluna and Landorus, and in the wake of several players being disqualified from the World Championship for using hacked Pokemon, some have argued that this constitutes an unfair barrier for entry into the competitive VGC scene. Of course, this element is hardly new when it comes to Pokemon, as almost every game in the franchise has been released in 2 or more separate versions with exclusive Pokemon found in each, forcing you to trade with other people in order to complete the Pokédex. But as DLCs and microtransactions have become more prevalent in the gaming industry, it's easy to see why some people are opposed to the idea of Amiibos, and the risk that they could be taking content away from the player instead of adding to the game experience. And while it's impossible to say what the real reasoning behind the lack of Amiibos is, there is one quote I'd like to end this video with. Before the release of Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, Masuda gave an interview with GameSpot, and the topic of the recently announced Amiibos was brought up. You might be aware that Pokemon as a brand used NFC for Pokemon Rumble U for the Wii U, he told GameSpot. Not in the exact same way as that, but if we can find some really cool way out to use Amiibo with NFC and add some new type of gameplay, then I think we'd definitely be supportive of using it in the future. And at the end of the day, it might be as simple as that. If they can find a way to make it fun and engaging, then maybe we'll see Pokemon Amiibos in the future. But for the sake of collectors and completionists, I just hope they don't take the sitting cuties approach.
That was brilliant, Candles Meat. Very much enjoyed